Ever since the invasion by Russia into Ukraine 3 weeks ago, I've been arguing on this channel that the rise of a new Russia, together with a new China and a new India, all in the form of what scholars are calling a new civilization state, is in fact creating a whole new world right before our very eyes. Now, if we don't manage to blow that world up by starting World War III like our neocons are advocating, the question before us is simply, what precisely is this new world that's rising from the ashes of Ukraine? What is this phoenix going to look like? And that is what I want to explore a bit with you on today's video. If you're new here, I am Dr. Steve. I'm your Patriot professor, helping to think better so you can feel better in these crazy and turbulent times. I'd very much appreciate you smacking that bell and subscribe button. So what is this new world going to look like? Well, first and foremost, I think we have to understand the world that's getting replaced. And the technical term for the world that's being replaced is what we call a neoliberal globalist world. And what we got to understand is that what we call neoliberalism or globalism is a world order that's very, very unique in that it's a world order that has virtually nothing to do with culture or civilization or religion or ethnicity. Instead, the neoliberal order, it's not so much a civilization as it is a system. It's not a civilization, it's a system. It's a global system made up of what's called a rules-based order, which involves the supremacy of democratically elected governments, corporate-based capitalism, and the notion of human rights, seeing humans as members of this system rather than being a part of their own unique cultures, customs, traditions, religions, and the like. And this rules-based order has been increasingly imposed on the various nations of the world over the last few decades, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, you might think, okay, what's the problem with that? That sounds pretty good. Well, the problem is that this rules-based system is a Western system. It's the peculiar creation of Western civilization. And so it's no coincidence that whenever this rules-based system needs to be definitively interpreted and enforced, it's always Western powers that arrogate to themselves the sole prerogative to do just that. And so increasingly the world sees neoliberalism really as nothing more than a Trojan horse for a kind of modern Western imperialism. And so it's no coincidence that nations like Russia are in the process of dislodging the totality of their political, economic, and cultural life away from the neoliberal globalist world and recalibrating, in this case, Russian society and culture around the notion of something called a civilization state, which is, in effect, the building of its own self-contained, self-sufficient life world. Russia is leaving the globalist world and building its own world, its own parallel economy, its own parallel currency, its own parallel entertainment and arts, its own parallel internet structure, its own parallel telecommunications, its own parallel sports leagues, space travel, you name it. And as part of this parallel world, Russia's neighbors, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, right, all the stands. And yes, we can add occupied territories of Ukraine into this mix. They're all satellites, as it were, this new Russian world. And Russia appears to be currently joined in this civilization state by none other than China. China, too, is building its own world, its own self-contained, self-sufficient life world that's joining together with Russia in an alliance between two grand civilizations, working together to undermine the current neoliberal globalist world. And one of the first things that we're seeing emerge here is the creation of a completely independent international monetary and financial system among Russia and its satellite nations, as it's interconnected with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, we've got to understand here, this is a massive alternative international monetary system that is completely dislodged from the globalist monetary system that not only uses the dollar as its default currency, but it also uses a single international financial transaction system known as SWIFT, right? So up until this point, both SWIFT and the dollar have been the primary mechanisms for the enforcement of a neoliberal globalist order all over the world. Those days are over. We have upwards of 30% of the world's population now beginning to avail themselves of an entirely independent financial and monetary transaction system. And now, on top of that, we did a video yesterday on the widely reported news that Saudi Arabia is in talks with China to be pricing oil sales in the yuan, the Chinese currency, rather than dollars or euros. So we're beginning to see, at least in part, the end of what's called the petrodollar, which up until now has been the default currency for international oil exports. That's been the case since the 1970s. Again, those days are over. We're beginning to see the sphere of the world centered on civilization states recalibrate the global economy away from the West and centered on the East, or Eurasia. Now, whether this means a full de-dollarization, that's anyone's guess at this point. But the days of the U.S. and the EU imposing crippling sanctions on nations, it's coming to an end. That nation would just have to hook up with this new parallel world of the emerging Eurasian civilization states, and they can tap into a fully functioning, autonomous, prosperous parallel economy that will more than supplement the U.S. and EU sanctions. And without the mechanisms by which U.S. and EU can call the shots all over the world, the globalist world order, the neoliberal order collapses. And that is exactly what we're seeing. I have to say, I think this, at least in part, is one of the reasons our so-called leaders in Washington, D.C., the dolts in D.C., as I like to call them, I think this is one of the reasons they've become so hysterical of late, calling for World War III and the insane notion of a no-fly zone. They've begun to despair over the realization that they simply don't call the shots anymore over an increasingly post-globalist world. And what this, of course, means is that in the end, we're looking at a world where the United States will continue to be very, very strong militarily and even economically, but we're not going to have a lot of pull or leverage in world events anymore. That appears to be moving over to the Eurasianist civilization states. How will that look? Well, we're going to have to wait and see on that one, especially when it comes to the fate of Taiwan. I have to be honest, I'm not very optimistic on that, to say the least. Another factor here is what will be the relationship between the rising civilization states and the growing populist patriot movements here in the West. So, of course, we're talking Trump, we're talking Marine Le Pen in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil, the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, right? Patriot parents at school board meetings. What's going to be the relationship between these massive Godzilla-like civilization states in Russia and China and India and the various patriot movements throughout the West? Well, scholars actually tend to see a natural correlation between the concerns of populist patriots who are turning back to the hallmarks of civilization, such as nation culture, custom, tradition, faith, family, religion, and the concerns of the more massive civilizational states in the East. So there does appear to be significant compatibility between the two, though the West, obviously, it promises through its populist movements to hold on to the nation-state model and keep their respective political spheres relatively limited, especially with so many, frankly, breakaway secessionist movements currently going on. But regardless, a new world is truly emerging out of the ashes of Ukraine. As tragic as the situation is, it does mark the end of the old neoliberal globalist order in a fashion far more dramatic and far faster than any of us could have ever imagined. Now, before you go, you will definitely want to check out my latest video just uploaded on a Wisconsin investigator calling on the decertification of the 2020 election. You are not going to want to miss that, so make sure to click on the link, and I will see you over there. God bless.